have a particularly significant attribute as a country, and that is what our nationalist leaders coined the slogan, and maybe a cliche, unity in diversity. The diversity was a product of our geography and our history, but so too was the unity. When I speak of unity, I'm referring to a civilizational unity to which an attempt was made to create a territorial form. So, for example, if you go back to the Rig Veda, which is at least 3,500 years old, we are looking at a reference to Bharatvarsha as the land between the Himalayas and the oceans. So that old an idea. If you look at Adi Shankaracharya from our own state of Kerala, in the 7th century after Christ, he traveled up and down the length of the subcontinent, establishing his mutts in Kashmir, in Gujarat, in Orissa, in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala. So the Harvard scholar Diana Eck has spoken of the sacred geography of India, knit together by countless tracts of pilgrimage. But if you think that is a purely Hindu idea, think again. Maulana Azad, the great nationalist of the mid-20th century, has written about how Indian Muslims traveling on the Hajj would be greeted by other Muslims, Arab Muslims, as being from one recognizable place, Al-Hind. Whether they were Tamil Muslims from the southeast of our country or Pathans from the northwest, they were spoken of as being Hindi. That was how the rest of the world saw. So everyone saw India as one recognizable common cultural space. Within that cultural space, territorial boundaries shifted over time, but the more powerful empires always tried to control the entire subcontinent, including Pakistan, much of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and beyond. And there, what do we have? We have the famous example of Ashoka and Chandragupta in the 3rd century BC, who controlled 90% of the subcontinent. And then you have the famous example of the Mughals, particularly under Akbar and Aurangzeb at the peak, who controlled about 95% of the subcontinent. So what the British did to create the India we know today was merely a success using modern techniques and technology of what had been attempted in the ancient days by other rulers. Now within this space, however, there was this enormous diversity that I've talked about. What is striking, for example, is that when in a much smaller country like Italy, you had a number of small principalities coming together to form one country in the late 19th century. At that time, a great Italian nationalist, Massimo Tapparelli d'Azeglio, memorably wrote, "We have created Italy, now all we have to do is to create Italians." Now, no Indian nationalist would have felt the need to say that. Jawaharlal Nehru felt that our nationalism actually merely reflected what had always existed since time immemorial, to which perhaps we were giving, the nationalist leaders were giving expression in the 20th century to these ancient longings. But yes, one could argue that the India that was created in 1947 was indeed, in many ways, very different from what had existed before. Because after all, it was an India that divided the Punjabi from the Punjabi for the first time into two separate countries. Similarly divided the Bengali from the Bengali into two separate countries. That asked the Keralite peasants to owe allegiance to a Kashmiri Pandit ruling in Delhi for the first time. That made fellow citizens of the Laccadivian and the Ladakhi also for the first time. So we were looking at, in that sense, the creation of a new territorial entity. But given the history I've described to you, given the variety I've described to you, it was very clear that the only way that this country could be united together was by acknowledging the idea of itself as an ancient land united by a common geography, sustained by a shared history, and ultimately kept thriving through a pluralist democracy in which everybody of every part of the country had an equal stake, where everybody felt they had the same rights, same obligations as everyone else, and they could thrive in this country on that basis. So that is the vision of Indian nationalism that our nationalist leaders fought for during the freedom struggle. This was the India that was born on August 15, 1947. We'll be celebrating our 70th anniversary this month, in just a few days. And what is special about this idea is that you have a country that can overcome divisions of caste, creed, color, culture, consonant, conviction, cuisine, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. That consensus is on the basic democratic idea that in a big, wide, pluralist country like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That is where our democracy is key to the future of our nationalism. Because that national identity is one that is therefore sustained by all these different elements from the past and from the present. Now, when I say this, I am very conscious that not all share this idea. If you like, we are, after all, at a Congress podium today, I can say bluntly, this is very much the Congress idea of India. This is the idea of Jawaharlal Nehru. This is the idea that inspired the Constitution. There are people in power today who do not share this idea. They have a very different vision of India. Rather than seeing it the way I have described to you, they would rather see India as a land that was once a pure, pristine Hindu country that has been invaded, as they see it, by foreign influences, whether Muslim, Christian, British, whatever, Mughal, all of these, for their point of view, are foreign because they're non-Hindu, and as far as they are concerned, the only true idea of Indian nationalism is of Hindu nationalism. Now, this is something that we have a profound problem with. We have a problem with it historically, because that is not an accurate portrayal of the history of India. We all know in Kerala, for example, that we had people in Kerala whose families have been Christian longer than any European family has been Christian. We know that in many cases, people in Kerala have been conscious of a Christian and indeed in some places of a Muslim identity going back to the lifetime of the Prophet. At a time when many who are today calling themselves Hindus were not fully conscious of their Hindu identity. So this kind of ahistorical approach is to begin with wrong. It is also wrong for a different reason. By considering anything non-nationalism, that fundamentally undermines and undercuts the actual reality of our country. I understand their logic. They say that India, the Indian national idea, is reserved for those who consider Bharat to be their Matrabhumi, their Pitrabhumi, and their Rashtrabhumi, and their Punyabhumi, I beg your pardon, and their Punyabhumi. In other words, that not only must you be born here, of a father and a father's line that is from here, but it must be the land where your religion is born. So for them, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism are okay, because this is your Punya Bhumi if you follow any of those faiths. Christianity, Islam, Zoroaster, etc. came from somewhere else, therefore it is not your Punya Bhumi, therefore you don't know. Now this is a very, very troubling version of what national identity is all about. Because when they say that, they are actually casting doubt on modern concepts of citizenship, and they are challenging the rights of their fellow Indians to consider themselves the same level of first-class citizen as themselves. To my mind, this is a very serious challenge to the notion of Indian identity and undermines in a disloyal way the shared allegiance that we all as patriots feel to our own country. I've always argued that the strength of Indian nationhood is you can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Keralite, proud of Kerala, a good Muslim, proud of Islam, and a good Indian, proud of India, all at the same time. The same person is capable of loving his country, loving his state and culture, loving his religion, and there is nothing wrong in that. Unfortunately, there is an attempt being made by certain people in our new ruling establishment to counteract this narrative. They are arguing instead that India should be very simply one language, one religion, one nation. The Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan idea of Indian nationalism. And this will inevitably create a backlash. Why is it that in Karnataka today, we are having people blacking out Hindi signs on the streets of Bangalore, on the metro stations, on the roadsides? Why is it that Karnataka says we must have our own flag? Why is it that a state which in every respect is in the heart of India and is totally committed, I have no doubt that every Kannadiga I know is totally patriotically Indian, why are they challenging this? They are doing so to resist the imposition of this narrower, more sectarian, more limited view of Indian nationalism upon those in India who resist it. And when I say those in India who resist it, I do not resist their right to be patriotic in their own way. I do resist their claim to tell me what I need to do to be patriotic like them. So I'll tell you about the Bharat Mata Ki Jai controversy. It was very ironic because I myself have had no hesitations in using that phrase. I happened to be, just a few months before this controversy erupted, I happened to be in a European airport. And I found myself in an airport bus with a huge majority of Indian pilgrims who were returning from somewhere. They'd gone on some sort of pilgrimage, God knows where in Europe, you can get a Hindu thing, but they'd all gone. And they were in the bus, and they recognized me. So one of them said, "Saab, aap kuch kahiye." So I said cheerfully, "Bharat Mata Ki Jai," and the whole bus, or 80% of the bus said Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And it was quite funny because the foreigners on the airport bus were astonished. Now, a couple of months later, we suddenly found our ruling party here saying that Bharat Mata Ki Jai is compulsory, that it has to be said by everyone. And a couple of very patriotic Muslims, in fact, one was an MLA in Maharashtra, one was a politician, said, sorry, in our religion, or our understanding of our religion, because not all Muslims agree with that interpretation, we cannot maternalize the nation and make her into a goddess. I'm very happy to say Jai Hind, but I will not say Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And to my astonishment, the whole controversy was whipped up. The ruling party and many others in other parties, I'm not saying it was only them, said this is wrong, this is unpatriotic, this is anti-national, this fellow must be suspended from the Maharashtra Assembly. And on top of that, we had episodes across northern India. I myself was in one hall once where the president of the BJP, Amit Shah, challenged the audience to all say Bharat Mata Ki Jai and asked those who refused to say it to raise their hand. There were about 1,000 people in the audience, only 7 of us raised our hands. And I was asked later, why did you refuse to say it? And I said very simply, I'll say Bharat Mata Ki Jai if I feel like, when I feel like, out of my own love for my country. I won't say it because the BJP president tells me I have to say it. That is the difference. In our democracy, that's why I mentioned democracy when talking about nationalism. Democracy gives us the freedom to be able to say or not say something, to sing or not sing Vande Mataram, to move in a particular way, conduct ourselves in a certain way or not. Of course, there are some exceptions. The national anthem is compulsory by law, and there is no serious debate. Even then, the Supreme Court has ruled that it cannot be made compulsory to sing the national anthem, only to show respect to it. So the famous Jehovah's Witnesses case, in which Jehovah's Witnesses were allowed to stand respectfully but to refuse to sing. Now these things in a democracy should not surprise us. It's the right way to go forward. But I just want to conclude by giving you an anecdote that summarizes what our nationalism is that differs from our neighbors. In 1971, you all know that Pakistan went to war with us in that terrible conflict that ended up with the creation, the liberation of Bangladesh. Now, when the Pakistanis did that, some foolish generals actually declared that they were conducting a jihad against the Hindu unbeliever. But who were they fighting the jihad against? An army commanded by a Parsi, General Manekshaw, the Air Force in the northern sector commanded by a Muslim, Air Chief Marshal Latif, Air Marshal then, later Air Chief Marshal Latif, a GOC&C Eastern Command commanding the troops that marched into East Pakistan. There was Sikh General Arora of the surrender of the East Pakistani forces after they had lost the war, was Jewish, Major General Jacob. And that is India. Each of these people were fighting for their country. They were nationalists, they were patriots. This narrow-minded version of what India is all about, what Indian nationhood is all about, undermines and discredits their courage, their bravery, their sacrifice. So I say to all of you, let us stand up for a truly robust Indian nationalism. Let us all be patriots. Let us not reduce the number of Indian nationalists by creating the idea that only people of a certain faith, and that to a certain interpretation of a certain faith, can be first-class citizens. Let us remember that Indian nationhood is a lofty, exalted, majestic idea that pulls us all together in a shared adventure that enables people who are Brahmins and Yadavs, who are Bodos and Bunts, who are Nayars and who are Pathans, who are Tamils and who are Haryanvi Jats, all to dream the same dreams together. That is our India. And today, a few days away from our 70th anniversary, I want to celebrate that idea of Indian nationalism with you. Jai Hind. Question and answers in the Happy to answer your questions. Sorry.
You talked about what do you call oneness, Union of India and things like that. But don't you think that the certain statistics or the when we take Kerala with the general average, the national average, in positive or negative way, we stay as an outlier? Kerala as an outlier?
But that's true of many other indicators. For example, in Kerala, you're referring to our social development indicators, where we actually have social development indicators that are closer to the United States than to the rest of India. And for a number of historical factors: literacy rate, maternal mortality, number of doctors and nurses per patient, number of newspapers per 10,000 population. All of these factors, we are comparable to the US and possibly higher than the US. Newspapers per population, we are actually higher than the US. But on the other hand, we are still Indian. I mean, when we look in the mirror, we see an Indian. And the important thing to stress is that these kinds of indicators, variety in this has never been seen as an indication of nationhood. In every country, even in Hitler's Germany, when they had this very rabid kind of nationalism, you would find that there'd be some parts of the country where people were more educated than others, some parts where there were, let's say, coal mines and other industrial establishments, some places with an older tradition. Even within Germany, for example, Bavaria was Catholic, the rest of Germany was Protestant. So these differences alone would not have been seen as undermining nationalism, provided, of course, they all paid allegiance to their Führer. That was the idea. To my mind, you may have, for example, 94% female literacy in Kerala and barely 49% female literacy in Bihar. But those varieties are things we all strive to deal with within our niche. But the mere fact that somebody is more educated than somebody else doesn't make them more or less nationalist than somebody else. Yeah.
Sir, claim Indian they claim that they are Aryans. And if Aryans, it's still under discussion on what their descendants are. So how can they claim that they are the Indians, they are true Indians?
They can't. I mean, Satya Parayana, true Indian, the Parayana, അബോറിജിനൽ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി ഇവിടെ താമസിക്കുന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ആദിവാസികൾ മാത്രമാണ് അത് നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ശരിക്കും ഇന്ത്യൻ. അവരുടെ തിയറി പ്രകാരം കൂടി അവർ എപ്പോഴായി രാജ്യത്ത് എത്തിയത്, എങ്ങനെ എത്തി. പക്ഷേ ഒരു കാര്യം പറയാം, നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്തിൽ സിമ്പിൾ എത്നിസിറ്റി നടക്കില്ല. നമ്മൾ DNA ടെസ്റ്റ് ഒക്കെ ചെയ്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ആക്ച്വലി ചെയ്യണമെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ പിന്നെ നമ്മുടെ മുഖങ്ങൾ നോക്കിയാൽ മതി. എത്ര നിറത്തിൻ്റെ വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്, ഫീച്ചേഴ്സിൻ്റെ വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്. അത് നോർത്തും സൗത്തും മാത്രമല്ല, കേരളത്തിനകത്ത് എൻ്റെ സ്വന്തം നമ്മുടെ കുടുംബത്തിൽ എൻ്റെ അമ്മമ്മയ്ക്ക് 8 കുട്ടികളാണ്. ചിലവര് ഒരു യൂറോപ്യൻ്റെ നിറമാണ്, ചിലവര് ഒരു ആഫ്രിക്കൻ നിറമാണ്. ഒരേ അച്ഛനും ഒരേ അമ്മയാണ്, ഒരു സംശയമില്ല. പക്ഷെ ഞങ്ങളുടെ എന്താ പറയാ, പിന്നെ ആ DNA ജനറ്റിക് മിക്സ്ചർ നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്ത് 3000-4000 വർഷം പിന്നെ ക്രോസായി മിക്സപ്പായി. ഇന്നലെ ഞാൻ ചെയ്തിട്ടില്ല, പക്ഷെ ആരോട് സംസാരിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു. അവര് ഇപ്പോൾ ഈ DNA ടെസ്റ്റ് അയക്കാൻ സാധിക്കുമല്ലോ. എന്തോ തുപ്പൂരും എടുത്തിട്ട് നമ്മൾ പാക്കറ്റ് അയച്ചു കൊടുത്താൽ ലാബിൽ $299 മറ്റേ അതിൻ്റെ പറയും നിങ്ങളുടെ. അയാൾ അതിശയം തോന്നി. അയാളുടെ ബ്ലഡിൽ പിന്നെ കോക്കസസ് മൗണ്ടൻസ്, റഷ്യയിൽ നിന്നും ഒരു ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ഉണ്ട്. മലയാളി കേട്ടോ. റഷ്യയിൽ നിന്ന് കോക്കസസ് മൗണ്ടൻസ് കണക്ഷൻ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, പേർഷ്യയിൽ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, കാസ്പിയൻ സീന്റെ ഒരു ഭാഗം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ഉത്തര ഭാരതത്തിന്റെ ഒരു ഭാഗം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ഇവിടുത്തെ രക്തമുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പൊ ആരാണ് ദ്രാവിഡൻ എന്നൊക്കെ പറയാൻ? DNA ടെസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്താൽ മതി. എല്ലാവർക്കും എല്ലാം ഉണ്ട്, ആർക്കും ഒന്ന് മാത്രമായിട്ടില്ല. അങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മളുടെ ചരിത്രം. 4000 വർഷത്തിന്റെ കഥയാണ്. We were trading with the Roman Empire, for example. ഇപ്പോൾ റോമൻ ഹിസ്റ്ററി നോക്കുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾക്ക് നമ്മുടെ ചരിത്രത്തെ ശരിക്കും സംരക്ഷിക്കാൻ സാധിക്കാത്ത വലിയൊരു സങ്കടമുള്ള കാര്യമാണ്. ഞാൻ ചരിത്രം എഴുതി വായിച്ച് പഠിക്കുന്ന ഒരാളായ എനിക്ക് വലിയ സങ്കടം തോന്നുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ പണ്ട് കാലത്തെ കുറിച്ച് നമ്മൾ എന്താ നോക്കേണ്ടത്? റോമൻ എംപയറിന്റെ സെനറ്റിൽ സംഭവിച്ച പിന്നെ ഡിബേറ്റ്സ്, അത് പ്ലിനി ദി എൽഡർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻ ഉണ്ട്. 1st century AD, 2000 വർഷം മുമ്പ് അദ്ദേഹം എഴുതിയതാണ്. ആ സമയത്ത് റോമൻ സെനറ്റേഴ്സ്, അവിടുത്തെ രാജ്യസഭ പോലെ, അവരെന്താ പറയുന്നത്? ഞങ്ങളുടെ സ്ത്രീകള് ഈ രാജ്യത്തിന്റെ സ്വർണമെല്ലാം ഇന്ത്യക്ക് അയച്ചു കൊടുക്കുന്നു അവരുടെ ടെക്സ്റ്റൈൽസ് മേടിക്കാൻ. ഇത് വലിയ തെറ്റാണ്. നമ്മൾക്ക് റോമൻ എംപയറിലെ സ്വർണം പോരാ, നമ്മളെല്ലാം ഇന്ത്യക്കാണ് അയച്ചു കൊടുക്കുന്നത്. അവരുടെ കോട്ടനും ലിനനും മസ്ലിനും ഒക്കെ നമ്മുടെ സ്ത്രീകൾക്ക് ഇടാൻ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടിട്ടാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. ആ കാലത്തിന്റെ വെച്ച് 2000 വർഷം മുമ്പ്. അപ്പൊ നിങ്ങൾ വിചാരിച്ചോളൂ എത്രയൊക്കെ ട്രേഡ് കോൺടാക്ട് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ചിലർ സ്ഥാപിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞു ഈ അറേബ്യൻ പെനിൻസുല, പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഒമാൻ ആൻഡ് യമൻ, അവിടുത്തെ DNA-യും ഇന്ത്യയിലത്തെ വെസ്റ്റ് കോസ്റ്റിന്റെ DNA-യുടെ ഒരു വ്യത്യാസമില്ല. ഒരേ ആൾക്കാർ, അവർ അറബ് ഭാഷ സംസാരിക്കുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മളിവിടെ മലയാളം സംസാരിക്കുന്നു. അത്രത്തോളം മിക്സ് 3000 വർഷം സംഭവിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. കപ്പലുകളിൽ പോയി ട്രേഡ് ചെയ്തിട്ടും വന്നിട്ടും പോയിട്ടും. അപ്പൊ ആരാണ് ശരിക്കും അറബുകളും മലയാളികൾ മാത്രമല്ല, നമ്മുടെ ഹോൾ വെസ്റ്റ് കോസ്റ്റ് ആണ്. പക്ഷെ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് മലയാളികൾ അത്രത്തോളം ട്രേഡും കോമേഴ്സും ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ എത്രയ്ക്കും ഒരു വ്യത്യാസമില്ല. DNA ഒന്ന് പോലെയാണ്. ഒരേ മിക്സ്ചേഴ്സ് കാണുന്നു. ചിലപ്പോൾ അവരെ കാണുമ്പോൾ ഇന്ത്യക്കാരാണെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കും. അവർ നമ്മളെ കാണുമ്പോൾ അത് നമ്മൾ ആരംഭിച്ചാണ്. നമ്മൾ അതല്ലേ ചില ഇന്ത്യക്കാര് ആരം വേഷം കെട്ടി നടന്നാൽ അവിടെ നന്നായി എളുപ്പത്തിൽ ഇന്റഗ്രേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. കാരണം ശരിക്കും വേറെ ഒന്ന് ചെയ്യും. അപ്പൊ ഈ ആര്യൻ ദ്രവിഡിയൻ എന്നൊക്കെ ശരിക്കും ടെക്നിക്കലി ആര്യൻ ഇസ് ആക്ച്വലി ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് ഇൻഡോ യൂറോപ്യൻ ലാംഗ്വേജ്. അപ്പൊ സംസ്കൃതത്തിൽ നിന്ന് വരുന്ന ഭാഷകളെ ഇൻഡോ യൂറോപ്യൻ എന്ന് പറയും. അത് പിന്നെ ഒരു ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് ടേം. അതിലും കൂടി ചില സർക്കാരുകൾ വിവാദം. Yes.
So this question is from Shashi in Mumbai.
Oh, somebody in Mumbai sent you a question. It was Facebook again. Twitter. All right.
So the question is this: the reconciliation of the competing versions of Indian nationalism is only possible when we deconstruct the colonial description of India and reconstruct it with a clear-eyed objectivity. And now, when cultural nationalism has replaced Indian nationalism, what's the part which Congress should play and bringing it back to the original view, or what Jawaharlal Nehru wanted it to be?
No, I think the Congress Party should play a role in articulating all this. I do my part in my speeches, my writings. I'm sure others will do the same. I think clearly we have to be very clear what we mean and what we stand for when we speak of nationalism. You know, it's interesting, when I wrote my last book, An Era of Darkness, in which I attacked British rule very much as an Indian nationalist. I was very touched to be applauded by the Prime Minister and other members of the present ruling party. But there was a very big difference between my approach and theirs. I speak of 200 years of foreign rule. the Prime Minister in his speech spoke of 1200 years of foreign, which means for him, all the Muslim rulers were foreigners. But that is simply not accurate. Babur may have come from outside, but his son was already half Indian through an Indian mother. His grandson was only a quarter foreigner in that sense, if you want to call it foreigner. In any case, after 2 generations in one country, I don't know how you're a foreigner. By the time of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th generations, the Mughals were overwhelmingly Indian in blood, Indian in ethnicity, and they had practically no trace left of the Ferghana Valley in their past. So how can you consider them foreigners? For me, the British were foreigners. They did not assimilate into India. They stole resources from here, drained them out to England, sent them back to England. That was what they did. And the interesting thing about this whole experience that we've had with the notion of foreigners is also the question of who was contributing to India and who was contributing out to the British. Were sending all their, even their salaries. The British civil service sent 80% of their salaries back to London. Their expenditures were there, their loyalty was there, they educated their children there, etc., etc. The Mughals, for example, they stayed in India, not just the Mughals, all the other Muslim rulers right down to South India as well, stayed in India, their children were born here. Whatever they made here or brought here was for India. So that they imported sometimes from Iran and Central Asia art, architecture, music, painting, sculpture, and introduced them to our country and contributed to the cultural richness of our country. Their great monuments were on our land, not like the big buildings of London paid for with colonial extraction and Indian and Caribbean money. So we're looking at a very different experience. And I cannot agree to assimilating the two of them as one. To my mind, those who came to this country, chose to be part of us, became us. They are as Indian as I am. Whereas those who exploited us for their purposes or the purposes of a foreign land far away, they are foreign. That distinction is a very important one to me. So I am insisting that we must not surrender the nationalist narrative to the BJP. I am proud of our nationalism in a constructive, inclusive nationalism. But at the same time, I will not accept the divisive nationalism that has been propounded by some members of the BJP and their supporters. Yes?
I need your opinion on the need for a discussion on nationalism. Somewhere I feel that the Nehruvian philosophy of India is very much correct, but is it relevant? As the modern Indians, the educated Indians, we discuss more about being rich or improving our standard of living. So
both are necessary, I would argue. First of all, the only reason that this discussion has become relevant again is because it has been challenged. Just in the last 25 years, we look at the first 45 years of India's independence. Everyone took it for granted. This was the logic of the freedom struggle. And certainly when it came to religious division, we felt that Indian nationhood required you to reject the logic that had divided the country through partition. Pakistan said religion is the determinant of nationhood. Our country is based on a religious identity, said the Pakistanis. India never fell into the trap of saying, okay, we've created a country for Muslims, we now create a country for Hindus. On the contrary, Indian nationalism rejected the idea that religion could determine nationhood, and it said, okay, Pakistan can be whatever it wants to be, a country for Muslims, fine, we are a country for everybody. Everybody who chooses to belong to India. It's only with the rise of the BJP in the late 80s and thereafter that the alternative argument that I've given to you, their version of Indian nationhood, has come into prominence. And now the duty is to resist it. Because if we don't resist it and argue the other traditional view of nationalism, a lot of young people may make the mistake of falling into the BJP's way of thinking and assume that the BJP interpretation of nationalism and nationhood is right. They are wrong. Okay? But I thank you all very much for listening to me. Namaskar. Jai.